American fortunes in their first generations are built through appetite for land, for trade, for anything that can be bought low and sold high. The builders of these fortunes move fast, speak plainly, and care little for the opinions of people who produce nothing. Then comes the second generation, then the third, and suddenly the grandchildren of fur traders are deciding who belongs in New York society and who does not. And yet, the Astor family wrote this script before anyone knew it was a script. From the docks where cargo arrived to the ballrooms where bloodlines were examined, they transformed raw accumulation into refined power. They built the buildings where New York lived, then built the rules for who could enter them. And when America needed an aristocracy, they simply declared themselves one. Therefore, today, we explore the history of the family that taught America how to be rich and discovered that the hardest fortunes to maintain are the ones built on knowing who to exclude. The year is 1848, and New York murmurs outside in carriage wheels and iron shoes while the Astor mansion feels unnaturally quiet. Inside, behind drawn velvet and mahogany darker than the winter sky, John Jacob Astor lies at the end of a life that began in a butcher's cottage in Waldorf, Germany, and stretched into the largest fortune the young republic had ever seen. He crossed the Atlantic with flutes wrapped in cloth, mastered the fur trade, gambled on distant ports, and quietly built the soil that would become Manhattan's most valuable square miles. Now his breaths are thin, and his son William Backhouse Astor stands beside him, absorbing the weight of an empire that began with ambition rather than inheritance. Astor's final message is not poetic, it is a command. Make it grow. That charge will ignite the rise of a dynasty spanning New York streets, British titles, great houses, heiresses, scandals, and marriages that link America's first fortune to some of Europe's oldest bloodlines. In today's episode of Old Money Empires, we follow the Astor family from their German beginnings to the heights and pitfalls of becoming America's first old money dynasty. America's first multimillionaire, John Jacob Astor, entered the world in 1793 in Walldorf, a quiet German village where futures were usually inherited, not invented. His father cut meat for a living, his mother kept the household steady, and nothing in the rhythm of their days suggested that one child would rewrite the arc of his bloodline. But Astor had a restlessness that didn't fit the size of the place, and soon he was on the road to London, trading the sound of livestock for ship horns and crowded workshops. An uncle taught him to build and repair musical instruments, a craft that demanded patience, precision, and the ability to see value where others saw scraps. London also gave him English, connections, and a glimpse of how commerce moved when the world grew wider. In 1784, he boarded a ship for the United States with a handful of flutes and the kind of hope only a young man with nothing to fall back on allows himself. New York greeted him with unpaved streets and untapped potential, and he opened a modest fur shop that positioned him at the edge of a booming trade. When the Jay Treaty cleared the way for Americans to access British fur posts in Canada, Astor expanded aggressively, building a network that stretched from the Great Lakes to European buyers hungry for pelts. By the turn of the century, he was worth around $6 million, a figure that dwarfed nearly every fortune in a country still defining itself. He expanded into trade with China, moving furs in one direction and returning with tea and goods that filled the pockets of early American elites. Then he began buying Manhattan real estate, acquiring land at a time when most people still viewed the island as a patchwork of farms and scattered buildings. His brother Henry added an unexpected footnote to the story when he bought the stallion Messenger, whose bloodline would eventually dominate American harness racing. Astor's ambition pulled him west as well, and he financed Wilson Price Hunt's arduous expedition to the Columbia River, a journey that stumbled often, but still carved routes settlers would later use on what became the Oregon Trail. By the 1820s, Astor's fur enterprise operated like a continent-spanning machine, one of the largest businesses in the young republic. When he exited the company in 1834, fashion already moving away from heavy pelts, he did so with a portfolio anchored in Manhattan land that was about to become priceless. And when he died in 1848, his estate was valued around $20 million, equivalent to well over $100 billion today when measured against the size of the American economy. He left $400,000 for what became the Astor Library, a foundation stone of the New York Public Library. His eldest son, John Jr., struggled with health and emotional instability, inheriting only a managed allowance. The empire itself went to William Backhouse Astor, who now faced the weight of a fortune large enough to shape a city. And before we follow William into the world he remade, a small note for our most dedicated viewers: the stories that are too scandalous, too reputation-shaking, or too unfiltered for YouTube live in our free Substack, linked in the first line in the video description, waiting for those who want the entire truth beneath the polish. Next, we'll see how William Astor's instincts would redefine the family, starting with his quiet plan to turn land into power. William Backhouse Astor inherited more than a fortune when his father died in 1848. He inherited the responsibility of proving that American wealth could stretch beyond one remarkable generation. He watched his father build the fur empire brick by brick, or pelt by pelt, and understood that the next chapter of the family story wouldn't be written in fur. It would be written in land. New York was still rough at the edges, a rising city rather than a finished one, but William sensed something in its grid and its geography that others ignored. He believed Manhattan was destined to become the commercial brain of the nation, and he wanted the Astor name woven into the island before the world realized what it was worth. He expanded the real estate purchases his father began, moving methodically, quietly, and with it that rivaled any modern long-term investor. Instead of chasing speculative ventures or indulging in luxuries, William built and acquired more than 700 houses and storefronts, embedding the family into the economic heartbeat of New York. His properties around the emerging Central Park proved especially shrewd, rising in value year after year as the park transformed a patch of contested land into the city's green crown. In an age without income tax, without inheritance tax, and without the regulatory hands that would later tame American fortunes, the rents flowed steadily and compounded freely. Wealth that had once seemed extraordinary under his father now grew into something structural, something lasting, something that made the Astors not just rich, but foundational. But William understood that money alone does not sustain a dynasty. Real influence requires alliances. On May 20th, 1880, he married Margaret Alida Rebecca Armstrong, a woman whose lineage ran deep into the political bloodstream of early America. Her father, John Armstrong Jr., had served as President James Madison's Secretary of War. Her mother descended from the Livingston family, a dynasty that had shaped colonial New York and produced founding father Robert R. Livingston, the man who administered the presidential oath to George Washington. Margaret brought legitimacy, history, and a bridge into circles money alone couldn't open. Their union produced children that would carry the Astor name into new realms, and the first to take the reins was John Jacob Astor III. Born in 1822, he possessed the steadiness of his father and the ambition of his grandfather, expanding the family fortune into the $75 to $100 million range, a sum that would place him among the giants of modern wealth if calculated against America's 19th century economy. He also initiated the English branch of the Astor family, a decision that would eventually carry the name into the British peerage and turn a German butcher's grandson into the ancestor of future viscounts. His sister, Laura Eugenia Astor, added another thread to the dynasty's web when she married Franklin Hughes Delano, linking the Astors to the family that would one day give the United States its longest-serving president. By mid-century, the Astors had become something rare in American life, a family with both vast material wealth and ancestry intertwined with the nation's early political architecture. Yet the transformation would not come from a boardroom or a marriage contract. It would come from a woman who understood that the true currency of the Gilded Age wasn't land or income. It was the ability to decide who counted. And her name was Caroline. When William Astor Jr. assumed his branch of the family fortune, he carried himself like a man who preferred balance sheets to ballrooms, but fate had paired him with a woman who saw society as terrain waiting to be shaped. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor entered the marriage with a pedigree that stretched deep into early New York, connecting her to the Dutch families who had occupied Manhattan long before it became a capital of money and spectacle. She had been raised in rooms where restraint was taught as a virtue, where manners were currency, and where lineage whispered louder than wealth. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, made his money in shipping, and her mother descended from the Van Cortlandt and White families, a heritage that gave Caroline the confidence of someone who believed her roots lay beyond criticism. In 1853, she married William and stepped into a world that was ready to expand, shift, and bend under the momentum of a new American century. A decade later, the couple commissioned a handsome brownstone at 350 Fifth Avenue, an address that would one day vanish behind the height and ambition of the Empire State Building, though no one at the time imagined the transformation. For many years, she lived quietly, attending to her home, raising her children, and enjoying the financial independence provided by her own inheritance, a luxury rare for women of the era. But as New York ballooned in size after the Civil War, the old social order began to fracture under the influx of industrial fortunes, transplants from across the country, and immigrants who altered the city's character block by block. The families who once held effortless control over Manhattan's drawing rooms suddenly found themselves competing with new fortunes that moved faster and pushed harder. Caroline stepped into this turbulence with the confidence of somebody who understood both the power of tradition and the need to wield it strategically. She aligned herself with Ward McAllister, a Southerner with an eye for etiquette and a talent for defining who belonged in the narrow corridor of privilege. Together, they curated a list that seemed to hold almost supernatural authority in Gilded Age New York. The 400, the number McAllister claimed could fit inside Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Acceptance became an event. Exclusion became a verdict. Her January balls became the unofficial state occasions of high society, where lineage, manners, and discretion mattered far more than the raw size of a bank account. Caroline's composure never faltered, and she navigated gossip the way seasoned diplomats navigate treaties, with calm detachment and a strict refusal to indulge in public emotion. Yet even she found herself at the center of a spectacle when customs officials seized the shipment of her gowns under suspicion of unpaid duties, prompting months of press frenzy over velvet, feathers, and a $300 fine. She emerged from the ordeal unshaken, and if anything, the episode only hardened the aura around her. The city itself had confirmed her status by attempting and failing to humble her. Her greatest challenge, however, arrived through a family whose fortune represented everything she believed money should never imitate: the Vanderbilts. She resisted them for years, dismissing railroad wealth as loud and inelegant, until Alva Vanderbilt staged a costume ball so dazzling that the absence of an invitation for young Carrie Astor became a diplomatic crisis. Caroline called on Alva, the invitation was extended, and the Vanderbilts were absorbed into the upper tier with a speed that signaled a shift in the balance of power. Her reign continued, but the edges of the world she had built were beginning to curl beneath forces far beyond her control. And soon the Astor legacy would shift from Fifth Avenue drawing rooms to a silent stretch of water in the North Atlantic, where tragedy would rewrite the family's place in history. When Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died in 1908, the ceremonial throne she had occupied for decades did not pass to a single successor because no one possessed her mixture of lineage, discipline, and quiet ruthlessness. Into the empty space stepped a trio of figures: Mamie Fish with her sardonic wit, Teresa Fair Ulrichs with her Western fortune, and Alva Belmont with her relentless ambition, each powerful in her own way, yet none able to command New York's social gravity the way that Caroline had. While they vied for influence, the Astor name migrated into the hands of a generation shaped less by ballrooms and more by a world tipping toward modernity. At the center of that shift was John Jacob Astor IV, the polished businessman whose interest ranged from real estate and invention to military service in the Spanish-American War, and whose fortune approached an extraordinary $87 million at the dawn of the 20th century. He carried himself for the knees of someone who understood that influence had become a public performance as much as a private inheritance. In 1912, he boarded the RMS Titanic with his young second wife, Madeline, expecting a comfortable return to New York after their stay abroad. The collision with an iceberg ended that expectation with cold finality. Reports later placed Astor on the deck, helping his pregnant wife into a lifeboat before stepping back to make space for others, his wealth and status powerless against a sea that recognized no hierarchy. His body was recovered days later, and with it a chapter of the American Astors seemed to close, the old world of inherited grandeur dissolving into a new century defined by forces wealth could not always control. But even as tragedy struck one branch, another was rising across the Atlantic, forging an identity that would endure long after Fifth Avenue mansions began to dim. William Waldorf Astor, grandson of the original patriarch, had already left New York in 1891 after a bitter rivalry with his aunt Caroline, an exile he transformed into opportunity. He embraced England with the conviction of someone who believed the old world still valued the things America had begun to discard: ceremony, lineage, and the slow accumulation of influence. By 1899, he had become a British citizen, and his fortune began reshaping historic estates, newspapers, and philanthropic ventures. During the First World War, his contributions earned him a barony in 1916, followed by elevation to Viscount Astor in 1917, cementing the family's arrival within the British aristocracy. His son Walldorf Astor and his daughter-in-law Nancy Langhorne, an American with a fluency for politics and performance, turned Cliveden into one of the most dynamic social and political crossroads in the United Kingdom, where statesmen, artists, and foreign dignitaries shaped the conversations of their age. By mid-century, a second title had joined the family's British portfolio when another branch descendant, John Jacob Astor, the influential newspaper baron, was created Baron Astor of Hever in 1956. With these elevations, the Astor story split into two hemispheres, one shaped by the fading architecture of old New York, the other by the polished rituals of Westminster. But titles alone could not guarantee permanence, and the forces gathering in the background, taxation, maintenance burdens, political shifts, and private scandals, are about to test the durability of a dynasty that once seemed immune to decline. And soon the world would see how the Astor legacy strained, adapted, fractured, and survived on both sides of the Atlantic. By the middle of the 20th century, the Astor name still carried the echo of a dynasty that once shaped both sides of the Atlantic, yet the machinery sustaining that prestige had begun to erode in places that earlier generations never imagined vulnerable. The American branch, once the unquestioned landlord of Manhattan, found its holdings gradually broken apart through sales, inheritance divisions, and the practical reality that a modern city no longer revolved around a handful of families as it once had. The British branch, despite its titles and its century-old estates, faced pressures of its own, because the cost of maintaining properties built for a different era pressed harder with every passing decade. Cliveden stood at the center of this new phase of the Astor story, both as a triumph and as a burden. When William Waldorf Astor purchased the estate in the 1890s and later gifted it to his son Waldorf Astor upon his marriage to Nancy Langhorne, he intended it as a stronghold of prestige rather than a symbol of responsibility. Under Nancy's direction, it became one of the great social engines of the early 20th century, a place where prime ministers argued over policy in the library, where Charlie Chaplin strolled the terraces, and where Winston Churchill traded quips under chandeliers imported from the continent. Cliveden absorbed not only politics but myth-making, and the rumors that swirled around the so-called Cliveden set during the 1930s created a cloud the Astors would spend decades dispelling. The estate also served as the backdrop for the Profumo affair, a scandal that shook the British government in 1963 and left the Astor family facing a level of public scrutiny few aristocratic houses had weathered in the modern age. By 1966, the family withdrew, handing Cliveden fully to the National Trust, ending an Astor residency that had once seemed immovable. Across the ocean, another chapter intertwined the Astor name with the oldest bloodlines in Europe through the marriage of Ava Alice Muriel Astor and Prince Serge Obolensky, a union that linked America's first great industrial dynasty to the Rurikid lineage that predated the Romanovs. Alice's inheritance, shaped by the tragic death of her father, the aforementioned John Jacob Astor IV on the Titanic, made her one of the wealthiest young women of the interwar years, and Serge's escape from the Russian Revolution brought a thread of royal exile into the family's tapestry of influence. Their son, Ivan Obolensky, embodied the crossing of two worlds, growing into publisher, financier, and a cultural figure who carried on the Astor instinct for reinvention without relying on the vast fortunes his ancestors once commanded. He became proof that legacy survives not only through land and titles, but through individuals who extended the story into new fields when the old ones fade. As the 20th century wore on, the Astor name settled into a quieter register, no longer the force that defined social boundaries, yet still woven into New York's foundations through streets, libraries, hotels, and neighborhoods shaped by decisions made generations earlier. When you hear the name Astor, perhaps you first envision the tragic tale of John Jacob Astor IV going down with the Titanic in 1912. The richest man aboard the doomed ship, he secured a lifeboat seat for his pregnant teenage wife before accepting his fate like a gentleman. Director James Cameron immortalized him in the classic 1997 film, the wealthy passenger reassuring others that the ship was unsinkable even as ice water flooded the grand staircase. Or Gen X and above viewers likely remember Brooke Astor, the grand dame of New York philanthropy who gave away $200 million before her own son was convicted of stealing from her. For decades, she was the face of American high society, elegant, generous, and seemingly untouchable until her final years revealed family dysfunction worthy of a soap opera. However, other New Yorkers know the name for different reasons entirely. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the New York Public Library, Astor Place. The family literally built the city's cultural foundations, and yet you and I can't name a famous American Astor alive in the 21st century. On the other hand, Brits have possibly heard of the Astors who became viscounts and barons, whose children marry into Belgian royalty, and whose stepchildren become prime ministers. And thus, a peculiar question comes up. How did one family's fortune create such wildly different outcomes? How did the same Astor bloodline produce British aristocrats attending royal weddings and American heirs no one has ever heard of? What happened between John Jacob Astor's fur trading empire and his descendants' divergent destinies? On today's episode of Old Money Empires, we explain how a single decision in 1890 split the Astor fortune in two. We'll reveal why British Astors keep climbing higher while American Astors struggle to pay heating bills. More importantly, we'll show you what this tale of two dynasties teaches us about how old money really works, or doesn't, in the modern world. Walk through Manhattan today and you'll trip over the Astor name at every turn. The iconic Waldorf Astoria Hotel still carries their legacy, even if they sold it decades ago. Bryant Park sits next to the New York Public Library, and Astor Place downtown reminds everyone who really built this city. Undoubtedly, for over 2 centuries, having Astor blood meant automatic entry to America's highest social circles. But here's what even people obsessed with the Gilded Age rarely mention. The Astor family split down the middle, and one side got everything, while the other got almost nothing. Indeed, today's Astors live completely different lives depending on which side of the Atlantic they call home. The British branch married into royalty and kept climbing higher, while the American branch watched their inheritance dwindle with each passing generation. In fact, the contrast is so extreme, it's hard to believe they share the same bloodline. On one side, you have Astors who are literally connected to the British crown through marriage. They attend royal weddings, own massive estates, and sit in the House of Lords. Their children go to Eton and Oxford, just like their parents and grandparents did. Meanwhile, back in America, where it all started, the story took a darker turn. The same fortune that created British viscounts and barons left some American descendants struggling to heat their family mansions, and what started as America's first great fortune became a case study in how differently old money survives in different systems. See, the split began in 1890, when William Waldorf Astor decided America wasn't aristocratic enough for his tastes. He packed up his millions and sailed for England, where money could still buy titles and titles lasted forever. His American relatives stayed put, believing in democratic ideals and individual achievement. Neither side could have predicted how differently their choices would play out over the next century. The British Astors learned to protect and grow their wealth through the aristocratic system. The American Astors kept splitting their inheritance until mathematics caught up with them. The results of that test reveal uncomfortable truths about how wealth really works on both sides of the Atlantic. By the 1880s, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land, but couldn't balance its own books. The agricultural depression had destroyed rental income from tenant farmers. American wheat flooded European markets at prices British estates couldn't match. Death duties, introduced in 1894, would take 8% of an estate's value every time it passed to an heir. Magnificent country houses that had stood for centuries suddenly became white elephants. The Duke of Manchester was so broke he had to auction his furniture. The Duke of Marlborough couldn't afford to fix Blenheim Palace's leaking roof. Titles that once guaranteed wealth came with crushing maintenance bills and no income to pay them. Meanwhile, American industrialists had more money than they'd ever dreamed possible. The railroads, steel mills, and stock markets created fortunes that dwarfed European aristocracy. But these American millionaires discovered that money alone couldn't buy them respect in their own country's rigid social hierarchy. You could own half of Pittsburgh but still be snubbed by families who traced their lineage to the Mayflower. Thus, the solution emerged naturally. British titles needed American cash, and American cash needed British titles. Between 1870 and 1914, over 60 American heiresses married into European nobility. They brought over $200 million, about $6 billion today, into the European aristocracy. These weren't passionate romances or unions based on real love. They were business mergers between two types of power. For example, Consuelo Vanderbilt's mother locked her in her room until she agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. The Duke needed her $2.5 million dowry to save Blenheim Palace. Consuelo needed the title to elevate the Vanderbilt name above new money status. One woman named Jenny Jerome brought $200,000 to Lord Randolph Churchill and gave birth to a son named Winston. If you'd like to hear even more historical secrets about the Spencer Churchill family, which includes both that young Winston and a future princess named Diana Spencer, the best place to get the aristocratic gossip is our free Substack newsletter, where we feature documentaries too scandalous for YouTube and much more. So visit the first link in the video description below to find out. And yet each dollar princess deal followed the same brutal logic: cash for class, dollars for duchesses. Now, our first protagonist, William Waldorf Astor, watched this transatlantic trade with growing interest. He'd inherited $40 million and owned much of Manhattan, but Caroline Astor still treated him like a poor relation. She controlled New York high society with her famous 400 list, and she made it clear that William's branch didn't quite measure up. In 1890, William made a decision that would split the Astor family forever. He closed his American accounts, liquidated what he could, and sailed for England with his fortune intact. Unlike the American heiresses who married for titles, William could afford to buy his own. His millions found a warm welcome in London, where American money didn't carry the stigma it did in New York. He purchased Hever Castle, where Anne Boleyn had lived, and began his campaign for a peerage. Within months, he was entertaining British aristocrats who needed loans, investments, and financial partnerships. By 1899, he'd become a British subject. By 1916, he'd been created Baron Astor, then Viscount Astor. His American relatives thought he'd lost his mind, trading democratic equality for feudal hierarchy. William knew better. He traded a system that could erode fortunes for one designed to preserve them forever, and soon the truth would show which side of the family had made the safest bet. The British Astors have played their cards perfectly, and it is shown in every generation since. William Astor, the current 4th Viscount Astor, sits in the House of Lords as a conservative hereditary peer. Born in 1951, he inherited a title and a network that reaches into every corner of British power. He married Annabel Lucy Veronica Jones in 1976, and here's where it gets interesting. Annabel brought her daughter Samantha into the Astor family from a previous marriage. That daughter grew up to marry none other than David Cameron, who became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. An Astor is literally the stepfather-in-law of a recent British Prime Minister. You can't buy that kind of connection, but apparently you can marry into it. The 4th Viscount had 3 children of his own: Flora Catherine, William Walldorf IV, and James Jacob. Each one maintains the family tradition of keeping a low profile while staying deeply connected to power. Flora focuses on family life away from the cameras. Young William has the burden and blessing of knowing he'll be the 5th Viscount someday. Jake, as he prefers to be called, found his own path while respecting family traditions. But the political connections run even deeper. John Jacob Astor VIII, the 3rd Baron Astor of Hever, took a different route to power. Born in 1946 and educated at Eton, he survived the 1999 House of Lords reform that kicked out most hereditary peers. From 2010 to 2015, he served as Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Defense. This meant real responsibility during a time of active military operations, not ceremonial duties. His son Charles made headlines with a fairy tale wedding in 2017. He married Princess Eliane of Belgium at Hever Castle, the same place where Anne Boleyn once lived. The bride's father is a Belgian prince, adding another layer of European nobility to the Astor mix. They've already had 2 daughters, Amadea and Allegra, representing the newest generation of titled Astors. The connections multiply through extended family branches as well. Harry Marcus George Lopes carries Astor blood through his family tree, inheriting the legacy of both the Astor and Lopes dynasties. His ancestors include Manasseh Massey Lopes, the 2nd Baron Robre, and Sephardic Jewish nobility like Duarte Lopes. But Harry's recent relevance comes from who he married. Laura Rose Parker Bowles is Queen Camilla's daughter from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles. This makes Harry Lopes, with his Astor heritage, the stepson-in-law to King Charles III himself. The Astor bloodline now literally connects to the British throne through marriage. Then there's Rose Astor, daughter of David Astor of Jupiter Asset Management. She married Hugh Van Cutsem, whose family holds a unique position in royal circles. Hugh's father was King Charles's best friend from their Cambridge days. Their daughter Grace served as a bridesmaid at William and Kate's wedding, the famous grumpy bridesmaid whose frown became an internet sensation. Even the younger generation knows how to make strategic moves. Charles John Astor, known as Shaky, briefly dated Pippa Middleton before she married James Matthews. Born in 1982, Shaky runs a children's entertainment company for wealthy clients. He holds a Guinness World Record for pantomime horse racing, proving you can be both aristocratic and amusing. Therefore, the modern Astors have indeed become integral to the British aristocracy, more than mere residents across the pond. Meanwhile, back in America, the Astor fortune was taking a very different path through the hands of Vincent Astor and his unusual wife. While their British cousins were marrying princesses, the American Astors were watching their fortune disappear piece by piece. The death of John Jacob Astor IV on the Titanic in 1912 marked more than a personal tragedy. It symbolized the beginning of the end for American Astor dominance. His son Vincent inherited the bulk of the estate and tried to do something different with it. Vincent Astor was probably the last American Astor with real financial power. He bought Newsweek magazine in 1937 when it was struggling and turned it into a major voice in journalism. The magazine operated out of a building his father had constructed, keeping everything in the family. But Vincent had what his family biographer called a social conscience, which in rich family speak means he gave away money rather than hoarding it. After serving in World War I, Vincent came home determined to change the family image. No more slumlords, no more squeezing tenants for every penny. He wanted the Astors to be philanthropists, not just property owners. Noble idea, but it came with a price. Vincent married Brooke Russell in 1953, his third marriage and her third as well. Brooke Astor became the most famous American Astor of the late 20th century, but she wasn't born an Astor. She was a military officer's daughter who married well, 3 times. When Vincent died in 1959, he left Brooke in charge of the Vincent Astor Foundation. She gave away nearly $200 million to New York institutions over the next several decades. The New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum, the Bronx Zoo, they all benefited from her largesse. She won the Presidential Medal of Freedom and became the Grand Dame of New York society. But here's the thing about giving away a fortune. Eventually, you run out of fortune to give. Brooke's own final years turned into a tabloid scandal. Her son, Anthony Marshall, was convicted of stealing from her while she suffered from Alzheimer's disease. The trial revealed she'd been living in squalor despite her millions, with her own family fighting over the scraps. Anthony himself had quite a resume: Marine officer, ambassador, CIA operative, Broadway producer, but he'll be remembered for elder abuse and grand larceny. His son Philip was the one who exposed him, turning the family dysfunction into front-page news. The American Astors had other branches too, but they followed similar patterns. Ivan Obolensky represents one of the stranger twists. His mother was an Astor. His father was a Russian prince who fled the revolution. Ivan co-founded a publishing house that produced serious literature, including Pulitzer Prize winners. He maintained some dignity and achievement for the family, but the real money was long gone. The story repeats across the American branches. Impressive titles, important connections, past glory, current struggles. They held on to the name, but lost the fortune that made the name famous in the first place. Alexandra Aldrich dropped a bomb on the Astor legacy when she published The Astor Orphan in 2013. As John Jacob Astor's descendant through 5 generations, she had every right to tell the family's secrets. What she revealed was more shocking than any tabloid scandal. She grew up in Rokeby, a 43-room mansion sitting on 420 acres in Barrytown, New York. From the outside, it looked like the perfect aristocratic childhood. The house was a landmark of American Gothic architecture. The property included woods, outbuildings, and enough land to get lost in. But inside those 40-foot-long hallways, reality was very different. Everyone in my neighborhood assumed we were aristocrats and wealthy because I was raised in a mansion, Alexandra explained. I really grew up extremely poor. The heating didn't work in most of the house. The roof leaked so badly that entire rooms were abandoned to rot. Dust covered antique furniture that nobody could afford to maintain or sell. The place smelled like decay because it was literally decaying around them. Her father, Ricky, embodied the Astor contradiction perfectly. Harvard educated with a famous last name, he worked as the mansion's unpaid handyman. He had the Astor sense of entitlement, but none of the Astor money to back it up. The family survived on food that others threw away. A nearby pie factory discarded frozen TV dinners, and that's what the Astors ate for dinner. Indeed, it's wild to think that direct descendants of America's first multimillionaire were eating other people's garbage. Alexandra's grandmother was reportedly an alcoholic who spent her days in a haze. Allegedly, her father refused to get a real job because Astors didn't work for other people. The family clung to their 400 acres and their famous name while everything else literally fell apart. So this wasn't just one unfortunate branch of the family tree. The Rokeby Astors represented what happened when old money ran out of new money to sustain it. They had the house, the land, the name, the portraits on the walls, but what they didn't have was cash for heat, repair, or fresh food. The estate became their prison, too valuable to abandon, too expensive to maintain. Alexandra escaped by writing about it, turning family tragedy into literary success, but there's no way around it. The British Astors were busy collecting new titles, while their American cousins collected dust in empty rooms. Now, the Astors weren't the only Gilded Age family to face the challenge of preserving wealth across many generations. And looking at their peers reveals a pattern. American fortunes rarely survived intact past the 3rd generation. The Vanderbilts provide the most cautionary tale. Cornelius Vanderbilt left $200 million when he died in 1877, more than the U.S. Treasury held at the time. By 1973, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion, not a single millionaire showed up. They'd blown through one of the largest fortunes in American history in less than a century. The money went to Fifth Avenue mansions, Newport quote-unquote cottages, yachts, parties, divorces, and bad investments. Gloria Vanderbilt, the most famous modern descendant, had to build her own fortune from scratch in fashion. Anderson Cooper, her son, works as a CNN anchor, a Vanderbilt actually earning a salary. The Goulds followed a similar trajectory. Jay Gould died worth $77 million in 1892, but his children managed to lose most of it within one generation. His son George tried to corner the wheat market and lost millions, like his father tried to corner the gold market. His daughter Anna threw money at a French nobleman who turned out to be a fraud. By the time the grandchildren came along, they were already selling off estates to pay debts. Compare this to the British Astors, who kept accumulating titles and connections with each generation. Or look at the Rockefellers, who created trusts and foundations that still control billions today. The Rothschilds split their fortune across European branches, but maintained coordination and intermarried to keep wealth concentrated. And therefore, many of these families understood something the American Astors, the Goulds, and the Vanderbilts missed. Preserving wealth requires structures, not just money. Therefore, the difference between success and failure wasn't about working harder or being smarter. It was about understanding which system you were operating in and adapting accordingly. The British Astors joined an aristocracy designed to perpetuate itself. The American Astors stayed in a democracy designed to create new fortunes, not necessarily preserve old ones. One branch got it right, and the other became a cautionary tale. The Astors built America's first great fortune, then spent 3 generations figuring out what to do with it. Their answer involved buying castles, constructing hotels, and fleeing to England when democracy became too noisy. If you want to experience their world today, you'll need to leave Newport, where Beechwood is currently closed, and travel to New York or England. The properties that remain open offer wildly different experiences. One is a paranoid's fortress disguised as a Gothic office building. Another is a bohemian time capsule where nothing has been cleaned in decades. A third lets you drink cocktails beneath a mural that may depict its owner as a medieval king. The final 2 are English estates, where an American tycoon purchased his way into the aristocracy. In today's episode of Old Money Mansions, we take you to the 5 best places around the world to walk in the Astor family footsteps, ranked from hidden gem to aristocratic splurge. Of all the properties in the Astor portfolio, 2 Temple Place is the most architecturally idiosyncratic and personally revealing. This neo-Gothic fortress on London's Victoria Embankment is William Waldorf Astor's clearest statement of his psychological state. By the 1890s, Astor, then the world's richest man, had grown increasingly paranoid about kidnapping and the chaos of democratic society. He had relocated from America to England, declaring that the United States was no longer a fit place for a gentleman to live. When Astor showed the Countess of Warwick around 2 Temple Place, he demonstrated a lever on the first floor that, when engaged, locked every single entrance into the building. The entire structure could be sealed off from the outside world with one pull. Medieval paranoia in an industrial age, indeed. Construction began in 1892, designed by Gothic Revival architect John Loughborough Pearson. Pearson created a building entirely faced in Portland stone that resembled a medieval fortress transposed into the Victorian era. The exterior presents high walls, parapets suggesting castle battlements, and sculptural ornament by master carver Nathaniel Hitch. Above the parapets sits an ornamental weather vane representing the caravel in which Columbus sailed to America, symbolizing the arc of Astor's family from the New World back to the Old. The entrance forecourt is flanked by bronze lamp standards supporting cherub figures designed by sculptor William Silver Frith. The cherubs are depicted using a telephone and an electric light, a characteristic Astor gesture, marrying historical fantasy with contemporary innovation. Interior decorator John Dibley Craze designed the spaces in French Renaissance style, employing rich wood paneling, gilded ceilings, and marble fireplaces. The mahogany staircase features newel posts supporting carved figures from Alexandra Dumas's The Three Musketeers, Astor's favorite novel. The first floor gallery contains 10 ebony columns, topped with capitals carved to represent American literary characters, Leather Stocking from The Last of the Mohicans, and Rip Van Winkle from Washington Irving. Astor, having abandoned America, decorated his London office with icons of American imagination. Running above these columns is an elaborate frieze depicting 82 characters from Shakespeare, all carved in relief and gilded. The centerpiece is the Great Hall, a 70-foot-long chamber paneled entirely in pencil cedar, chosen for its aromatic properties. The scent was meant to psychologically prepare visitors for negotiation, subtly predisposing them toward conciliation. The cedar paneling is surmounted by a frieze displaying 54 carved historical figures: Bismarck, Martin Luther, Robin Hood, Maid Marian. Astor's private office includes a secret door and discreet drawers designed for champagne storage. Two Temple Place opened to the public in 2011 as a gallery operated by the Bulldog Trust. Exhibitions typically run January through April, open Monday through Saturday, generally 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. on weekdays. Monthly guided tours are available at approximately £10. Admission is typically free during exhibitions, making it one of London's most affordable entries into Gilded Age architectural fantasy. Now, Astor's paranoid office building represents one extreme of family character, and across the Atlantic, another branch took a completely different approach. If the St. Regis represents the Astor family's public-facing magnificence, Rokeby represents the quiet, intellectually engaged side of the dynasty. This branch valued books and art over ballrooms and society pages. The estate was originally built between 1812 and 1815 as La Bergerie by General John Armstrong Jr., a Revolutionary War general and U.S. Secretary of War under President Madison. His timing was dramatic. He was serving as Secretary of War during the War of 1812 when the British attacked and burned Washington, D.C. Blamed for failing to anticipate the assault, Armstrong resigned in disgrace and retreated to his Hudson River estate. The original structure reflected Federal-era principles, a rectangular two-story building with a hipped roof topped by a square pyramidal cupola. In 1818, Armstrong's daughter married William Backhouse Astor Sr., son and principal heir of John Jacob Astor, founder of the fur trade empire. In 1836, William Astor purchased the 728-acre estate from his father-in-law for $50,000. Margaret, a woman of literary sensibility, renamed it Rokeby after her favorite poem, Sir Walter Scott's 1813 work about chivalry and redemption. The name signaled that this branch cultivated intellectual interests. Under Astor's stewardship, the original 20-room mansion was enlarged to 48 rooms through additions that preserved the federal proportions. The grounds were redesigned with romantic movement sensibilities. Informal gardens, meadows allowed to return to semi-wild state, and carefully framed vistas of the Hudson River. Unlike the formal Italian gardens at Hever or the manicured beds at Cliveden, Rokeby's landscape emphasized the picturesque principle. The estate attracted writers, painters, and cultural figures who appreciated its Hudson River scenery and cultivated interiors. The house filled with first editions, paintings, sculptures, and accumulated material culture spanning 2 centuries. The turning point came through the marriage of the Chandler family, a Hudson Valley clan known for eccentric brilliance. The Chandlers produced painters, writers, architects, and patrons. This infusion transformed Rokeby from a gentleman's estate into something closer to an artist's colony. By the 20th century, it had become synonymous as a place of bohemian sympathies and intellectual nonconformity. Writers worked in the libraries. Musicians performed in the drawing rooms. Rather than undergo renovations, Rokeby was largely left to age naturally. This accident of conservatism, born from Depression-era financial constraints and philosophical indifference to fashion, resulted in a living palimpsest of 200 years of family history. Walls retain original painted finishes, faded but authentic. Furniture bears the wear of genuine use. Books remained where previous owners placed them. Rokeby remains in family hands, owned by descendants of the Astor, Livingston, and Chandler lines. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974, guided tours operate Wednesday through Monday at 11 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., lasting approximately 1 hour. Picnic tables behind the house allow visitors to spend an afternoon absorbing the romantic landscape. Now, while Rokeby's Astors retreated into books and bohemianism, another branch took the opposite approach, building temples to public luxury in Manhattan. The Astor family's Fifth Avenue private mansions have been demolished. John Jacob Astor IV's hotels remain as the most tangible connection to the family's Gilded Age dominance in Manhattan, outside of named streets and the New York Public Library. Arguably, the St. Regis stands as the finest modern survivor. John Jacob Astor IV inherited his position as one of the world's wealthiest men upon his father's death in 1890. While his cousin William Walldorf was buying castles in England, John Jacob IV resolved to reshape New York's hospitality landscape. He already had a stake in the Waldorf Astoria, completed in 1893. By 1896, he was contemplating a new property on Fifth Avenue at 55th Street, originally intended as his private mansion. Recognizing the neighborhood's shifting commercial character, Astor pivoted to a revolutionary concept, a luxury hotel rivaling any European palace while incorporating the latest technology. The site cost $600,000, roughly $19.8 million in 2025 dollars. The final development totaled $5.5 million. Astor commissioned Trowbridge and Livingston, known for their French Beaux-Arts design. They created an 18-story limestone palace completed in September 1904, and the New York Times acclaimed it as the finest hotel in America. The exterior facade was organized into 3 horizontal zones, mimicking a Greek column's proportions. Inside, Astor insisted every guest room have its own private telephone, an extraordinary extravagance when telephones were luxury items. The first floor featured a restaurant, cafe, and palm court. The second floor contained the grand ballroom and private dining rooms, all appointed in marble and bronze. And Astor's success inspired a second project, the Knickerbocker Hotel at Times Square, commissioned in 1905 to 1906. For its bar, Astor hired illustrator Maxfield Parrish to create a mural based on Old King Cole. The fee was $5,000, equivalent to $130,000 today. Parrish was a Quaker who didn't drink, but the offer was generous enough to overcome his reservations. Parrish executed 3 panels, each 8 by 10 feet. The central panel depicts King Cole on the throne, flanked by jesters. Contemporary observers noted the king's features bore a striking resemblance to John Jacob Astor himself. The mural hung in the Knickerbocker from 1906 until its closure in 1920. Then it was installed at the St. Regis in 1932, where it has presided over the King Cole Bar for nearly a century. John Jacob Astor IV did not live to see his hotel's full success. On April 15, 1912, he perished in the sinking of the Titanic. The hotel operates today under Marriott International, maintaining Forbes 5-star and AAA 5-diamond ratings. And though the St. Regis remains fully operational at premium nightly rates, non-guests can experience the King Cole Bar for the price of a cocktail, making it one of the most accessible entry points into the Astor legacy in Manhattan. The bar maintains its original Beaux-Arts appointments alongside Parrish's luminous mural, and the martinis served there carry implicit reference to an era when wealthy families used such establishments to consolidate power and display refined sensibilities. John Jacob Astor IV built his empire in Manhattan, but his cousin William Walldorf took the family fortune in a radically different direction, purchasing English history itself. Now, number 2 on our list is the most tourist-friendly Astor experience. William Waldorf Astor purchased the childhood home of Anne Boleyn and transformed it through a restoration so ambitious that it reads like a period drama made tangible. Astor first glimpsed Hever Castle in July 1901 and fell in love immediately. By 1903, he purchased the castle and its 630-acre estate from Edmund Meade Waldo. At the time, Hever was little more than a dilapidated farmstead. Astor saw a vessel for his Renaissance fantasies and his rejection of America. He had inherited one of America's vast fortunes in 1890, making him the richest man in that country. Yet he declared America no longer a fit place for a gentleman to live and moved to England in 1891 with a reputed $100 million. His time as Italian interior minister from 1882 to 1885 had stoked a passion for Renaissance aesthetics that would shape Hever's transformation. Between 1903 and 1908, Astor and architect Frank L. Pearson undertook an extraordinary restoration. The original 13th century gatehouse with Tudor additions was meticulously preserved. Every fragment of original stonework was retained. Victorian intrusions were replaced with materials faithful to the 16th century. Workmen were forbidden from using modern planes, laboring instead with adze and chisels. 740 skilled craftsmen worked simultaneously on elaborate carved ceilings and plasterwork, much by Nathaniel Hitch and William Silver Frith. The result was the Astor Wing, a 100-room extension built to appear as a cluster of Tudor village structures rather than one mansion. Astor wanted guests to enjoy 20th century comfort without the castle being diminished architecturally. The wing included central heating, a private power station, and an advanced firefighting system. A covered bridge connected it to the castle, and the gardens were Astor's artistic autobiography. Over 1,000 men transformed 125 acres of marshland into one of the world's greatest gardens at a cost of approximately £1 million, roughly 110 million pounds today. The Italian garden stretches 220 meters by 80 meters, encased by 4-meter-high sandstone walls. The Pompeian wall displays Astor's classical statuary imported from Italy. The nymph's fountain, carved by William Silver Frith, was inspired by Rome's Trevi Fountain. The 38-acre lake is entirely man-made, created by diverting the River Aden. 800 men worked day and night shifts for 2 years, using temporary railways and steam diggers. The lake filled in summer 1906, creating the illusion of a natural water feature gracing the medieval castle. Hever Castle operates as a fully open public attraction. Visitors can tour the castle interior, explore the Italian gardens, navigate the maze, and experience the lake. The castle houses Anne Boleyn's personal prayer books bearing her signature, along with Tudor portraiture and period artifacts. The estate is both an architectural marvel and a repository of genuine historical significance. It remains one of Kent's premier tourist destinations, allowing visitors to inhabit the same spaces where Astor once entertained aristocrats and political figures. Hever was Astor's romantic escape, but he had already acquired another English property with an entirely different purpose: political power. If Hever was Astor's romantic fantasy, Cliveden was his political power play. This is where he became an aristocrat, eventually taking the title of First Viscount Astor. The house remains one of England's most historically consequential estates. Cliveden sits elevated above the Thames, commanding one of the river's most dramatic vistas. The present house was designed by Charles Barry, architect of the Houses of Parliament, in 1851 to 1852 to replace an earlier mansion destroyed by fire. Barry's design synthesized English Palladian architecture with Roman Cinquecento elements. Astor purchased Cliveden in 1893 for $100,000, roughly $3.2 million today. Unlike Hever, acquired for romantic associations, Cliveden was a platform for political and social dominance. Astor reconstructed the interior around 1894 to 1895. Barry's original Victorian arrangement included a square entrance hall, morning room, and separate stairwell. Astor rejected this entirely, wanting something more Italian palazzo than English country house. Working with architect Frank Pearson, he amalgamated 3 rooms into a single great hall designed to announce authority. The ceilings and wall were paneled in English oak with ornamental Corinthian columns. Sculptor Frith carved staircase newel post with figures representing previous owners, Buckingham, Orkney. It was a subtle statement that Astor now belonged to this lineage. Gilded paneling was set against turquoise and adorned with carved hunting scenes, pheasants, dogs, and rifles, symbols of aristocratic leisure. In 1906, Astor married off his son Walldorf to Nancy Langhorne, a wealthy American from Virginia, and transferred Cliveden as a wedding gift before retreating to Hever. And Walldorf and Nancy transformed Cliveden into the epicenter of British high society. During the 1930s, it became headquarters of the Cliveden set, an informal circle of aristocrats and politicians whose views on Nazi appeasement made it controversially influential. And Cliveden's most infamous episode unfolded in 1961. Osteopath Stephen Ward, hired to treat Bill Astor, the second Viscount, for back pain, secured a lease on Spring Cottage for minimal rent. Among Ward's guests was 19-year-old Kristen Keeler, a call girl with connections to a suspected Soviet intelligence officer. During summer 1961, Keeler was swimming in Cliveden's pool when she encountered John Profumo, Secretary of State for War. Once public triggered a constitutional crisis. Profumo resigned from Parliament, and the scandal became emblematic of British establishment decay. In 1942, the Astors gifted Cliveden to the National Trust with a £250,000 endowment. It later became a luxury 5-star hotel, preserving the house's architectural integrity. The 376-acre estate features Grade 1 listed gardens with legendary carpet bedding designed by John Fleming. Now, Cliveden operates as a luxury hotel where guests can have tea in the Great Hall and stay in suites named for historical figures. National Trust members can access guided tours on designated days. The Profumo Affair break is marketed as a themed package for visitors interested in that particular scandal. Indeed, some legacies are stranger than others. So, from a paranoid's fortress to a bohemian retreat to Cold War espionage, the Astor properties tell the story of one family's attempt to buy permanence with money. During the height of the Gilded Age, when New York's money was new but trying very hard to look old, 2 hotels rose from Fifth Avenue and turned hospitality into theater. And they didn't just offer beds and meals. They offered a stage where America's richest families at the time could perform their own idea of civilization under ceilings painted to rival Europe's. You see, on one side stood William Waldorf Astor, a man wealthy enough to move to England and call himself a lord, yet still petty enough to drop a massive hotel next to his aunt's mansion just to unsettle her. On the other side stood his cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, heir to another branch of the family, who decided that if one Astor was going to put a palace on Fifth Avenue, then another Astor would simply have to build a taller one. At first, they stood apart as competing monuments, the Walldorf opening in 1893, the Astoria rising in 1897, but the cousins eventually called a truce, stitching their hotels together and creating the Waldorf Astoria, the address where Fifth Avenue learned to sparkle. Presidents, princes, opera stars, financiers, and tourists all swept through its revolving doors, while an army of staff kept the chandeliers lit and the illusion seamless. And for a few decades, it looked as if the building might stand forever, or at least as long as Fifth Avenue had carriages, evening gloves, and people who used calling cards unironically. Instead, it was demolished in under 40 years, and replaced by a skyscraper that would come to define New York more than any hotel lobby ever could. In today's episode of Old Money Mansions, we tell the story of how a family rivalry built a palace, how progress erased it, and how its spirit still lingers on in the city that tore it down. Family disputes rarely reshape a city, but the Astors managed to do that on a single block of Fifth Avenue. Thus, what began as a private feud between 2 enormously wealthy cousins soon produced a pair of hotels so commanding in scale and personality that they pulled New York's social gravity toward them almost overnight. To get the names right from the start, the first hotel was the Walldorf, opened in 1893 by William Waldorf Astor, who had decamped to England but still wanted his name carved in Manhattan stone. The second was the Astoria, opened in 1897, 4 years later, by his cousin John Jacob Astor IV, heir to another powerful branch in the family. The two structures stood shoulder to shoulder, divided by little more than brick, temperament, and a long history of Astor grievances. See, William Astor did not place the Walldorf at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street out of convenience. He placed it there to unsettle his aunt, Mrs. Caroline Astor, undisputed queen of New York society, whose mansion occupied the neighboring lot. She despised the sight of a commercial hotel rising beside her home and reportedly dismissed the project as a glorified tavern, a line that Cartier-level gossip carried through parlors and drawing rooms uptown. William's decision functioned both as a business move and as a pointed reminder that even the most entrenched families could wake up to find their neighborhood rewritten. 4 years later, his cousin John Jacob Astor IV answered with his own gesture in stone. He purchased the property where Mrs. Astor's mansion had once stood and hired architect Henry J. Hardenberg, the man who designed the Waldorf, to create a second hotel that would press its presence into the skyline even more forcefully. The second building, the Astoria, was not a mere echo. It was a statement that the Astor name would command the entire block, not through just one landmark, but through a pair of grand hotels working in tandem. Eventually, the cousins realized that their competition had begun to devour resources that could be better deployed in partnership. A truce emerged, and the two buildings were joined by a marble corridor, a physical alliance that turned feuding cousins into business partners and turned two hotels into a single legend. From that point forward, the property was known as the Waldorf Astoria, a unified empire of hospitality that set a new standard for what a luxury hotel could be in America. From debutante balls to diplomatic dinners, its room became stages where New York rehearsed and revised its own identity night after night. Its red sandstone facade, steep gables, and sculpted ornamentation gave it the aura of a European palace that had mysteriously landed in Midtown, only with better plumbing and more confident tipping. Yet even as the Waldorf Astoria stood united in stone, the forces that shaped their rise were already shifting beneath them, preparing a new chapter that no one in the family had entirely planned. Because while the hotels looked immovable from the street, their story was about to hinge on how they worked from the inside out. When the Walldorf opened its doors in 1893, New Yorkers reacted with a blend of curiosity and outrage, unsure whether William Waldorf Astor had built a hotel, a monument, or an insult. Its German Renaissance facade, carved in deep red sandstone with gables, balconies, and intricate detailing, stood defiantly on a block that had only recently been lined with mansions and leafy sidewalks. Neighbors complained that Fifth Avenue's domestic calm had been shattered by commerce, and Mrs. Caroline Astor considered the hotel not only an intrusion, but a personal slight. Her disdain traveled quickly, echoing through the parlors where reputations were made and unmade over tea and sharp observations. The public snickered as well, jokingly nicknaming the project Bolt's Folly, after its Swiss-born manager George C. Bolt, who had thrown his reputation and energy into making the hotel not just profitable, but indispensable. Bolt, however, understood the psychology of status as well as any social columnist. The day after the Waldorf opened, he hosted a charity concert for St. Mary's Hospital for Children, charging $5 a ticket, a sum that translates into well over $160 today. New York's elite filled the ballroom and turned what had been mocked as a vulgar intrusion into the new address where one simply had to be seen. By the end of its first year, the Walldorf generated more than $4.5 million in revenue, the modern equivalent over $100 million, and the phrase Bolt's Folly quietly retired from fashionable conversation. And it's the kind of conversation that, if you enjoy this kind of dynastic drama, the stories that get a little too chaotic for polite platforms live free on our Substack series on families too scandalous for YouTube, as well as their architectural histories. You can join that inner circle through the first link in the video description box below. But John Jacob Astor IV watched William Waldorf Astor's hotel transformation with intense interest. He understood that his cousin now controlled not just a building, but the most visible stage for wealth and ceremony on Fifth Avenue. So, in 1897, he unveiled his counterstroke, the Astoria, a 16-story tower that rose precisely where his mother's mansion had once stood, replacing old family domesticity with conspicuous commercial power. Hardenberg served again as architect, ensuring that the two hotels shared a visual language even as the Astoria asserted its own personality, a blend of French Second Empire and continental grandeur rendered in stone, marble, and brick. The Astoria contained more than 550 guest rooms and 25 public rooms, assembled into a vertical world of parlors, drawing rooms, banquet halls, and dining spaces that stretched from the sub-basements to the rooftop terraces. Its Louis XIV ballroom could seat around 700 guests for banquets and more than 1,000 for concerts, a chamber calibrated for sound, spectacle, and the art of being observed. Season tickets for the musical performances in that room could cost what now amount to more than $10,000, paid gladly by the patrons who considered their presence there as important as the music itself. When the cousins finally agreed to combine their operations, the merger became literal in stone. A 300-foot interior corridor, Peacock Alley, stitched the two hotels together, its polished marble floors and soft glow creating a kind of indoor catwalk where society figures glided between the Walldorf and the Astoria. This was not a street nor a courtyard, but a protected artery, a place where fashions, alliances, and quiet rivalries moved in step with the rustle of silk and the click of cufflinks. From this alliance emerged the Waldorf Astoria, the largest hotel in the world at the time, and the unquestioned headquarters of New York's ceremonial life. But as its profile rose ever higher, another story unfolded beneath those red sandstone walls, driven by people who would never see their names in society columns. And it was in that hidden, humming world that the hotel's true character came into view. The Waldorf Astoria was engineered to impress from the moment a guest crossed its front threshold, and few hotels on Earth could match the sequence of rooms that followed. The main entrance carried visitors into a sweep of marble and bronze, where the glow of chandeliers met the faint scent of flowers and polished metal. From there, the guests might drift into the Empire Room, a celebrated dining hall dressed in Empire-style mahogany, gold accents, and painted ceilings worthy of an evening spent simply looking up. Nearby, the Marie Antoinette parlor glowed with 18th century French antiques, silk upholstery, and the famous bust of the Queen presiding over conversation as if the guillotine had been someone else's problem. The Gentleman's Cafe, paneled in dark oak and lit by staghorn fixtures, created a hunting lodge fantasy in the middle of Manhattan, where financiers and politicians could trade rumors beyond the reach of reporters. Each of these spaces felt complete in itself, so that walking through the hotel was less like touring a single building and more like stepping through a sequence of carefully staged sets. The Astoria side expanded that theatrical logic upward. Its entrance opened onto Italian Renaissance pilasters, Russian marble columns, and silk hangings in rose and soft metallic tones, a composition that left no doubt about how seriously the owners took atmosphere. On the first floor, the Astoria Gallery offered a long, elegant chamber trimmed in blue, gray, and gold, lit by tall French windows that filtered daylight into something slow and flattering. The nearby colonial room, draped in red and finished with white woodwork, shifted the mood to something more intimate, as if designed for smaller gatherings where words mattered more than spectacle. Higher floors contained suites finished in Old English oak, each equipped with its own drawing room, bath, and generous trunk closets, amenities that most Americans at the time would have found almost unreal. Above them all, the Astoria Ballroom held court as the undisputed showpiece. Decorated in shades of ivory, gray, and cream with elaborate moldings and glittering fixtures, it could accommodate hundreds of diners or more than 1,000 concert goers without ever looking crowded. Season tickets to the events staged there cost sums that would translate into several months' wages for an ordinary worker, yet the waiting lists remained long. And still, the true engine of the Waldorf Astoria existed out of sight of these grand rooms. Behind the draperies and mirrored doors, the hotel functioned like a hidden city, powered by more than 1,000 workers, many of them European immigrants trying to carve out a future in New York. Elevator boys memorized schedules and faces, predicting when certain tycoons would appear without ever glancing at a clock. Scullery maids cleaned mountains of dishes and polished acres of silver in the deep hot spaces few guests ever saw. Bellhops formed a legendary bucket brigade on one famous occasion, hand-carrying water to fill a royal bathtub when plumbing faltered for Prince Henry of Prussia. In the kitchens, Oskar Tschirky, Oscar of the Waldorf, supervised brigades of cooks, whose days began before dawn and ended long after the guest had finished dessert. For these workers and their families, the hotel offered neither fantasy nor escape, but something far more practical and precious: a paycheck, a foothold in the city, and a sense of belonging to an enterprise that seemed, for a time, too grand to fail. Their labor kept the chandeliers glowing, the tablecloths spotless, and the illusion of effortless luxury intact. Yet, while they held the hotel together, forces beyond any bellhop or maitre d' were already shaping the city's expectations of what a modern hotel had to provide. And those new expectations would eventually turn this palace into something heavy, complicated, and unsustainable. For nearly 20 years, the Waldorf Astoria stood at the center of New York's social universe, a place where arrival in its lobby meant arrival in a very specific kind of world. Balls, charity galas, political dinners, and private performances filled its calendar, giving the city a venue that was part stage, part club, part diplomatic theater. Foreign dignitaries arrived with elaborate entourages and unique demands, including China's Viceroy Li Hongcheng, who brought century-old eggs and his own kitchen staff to ensure every meal met his standards. Financiers gathered in the Waldorf Astoria bar, a room that nurtured as many legends as cocktails, including the Rob Roy and the Bobby Burns. The hotel felt less like a building and more like a symbol of American confidence, proof that New York could produce spaces as elaborate as any European capital. Then the first fracture arrived, not in the masonry, but in the story of the family itself. In April 1912, John Jacob Astor IV boarded the Titanic with his young wife, traveling home from Europe in a display of wealth and ease that seemed natural to his position. When the ship struck ice and began to sink, he helped women and children into lifeboats before disappearing into the freezing Atlantic, never to be seen again. His death resonated across the English-speaking world, but in New York it carried a particular weight, as if a chapter in the city's own mythology had been cut short mid-sentence. The Edwardian era that had given birth to the Waldorf Astoria was beginning to fade, even if the hotel itself still glittered. Change initially came in subtle forms. The social center of gravity in Manhattan drifted north as new hotels and apartment houses rose closer to Central Park, pulling fashionable life away from 34th Street. The Waldorf Astoria, for all its splendor, had been designed in the early 1890s for the expectations of that decade. Its heavy masonry walls, which once suggested stability, made it increasingly difficult to keep pace with modern demands. See, by the 1920s, wealthy guests wanted private bathrooms in every room, reliable electric systems, better ventilation, and in many cases, mechanical cooling. To install that level of plumbing and wiring in the old structure would have required cutting into thick, load-bearing stone and reconfiguring entire rooms. Engineers calculated the cost and realized they were staring at a financial abyss. What had once been a palace now looked, on a balance sheet, like a white elephant, too solid to adapt, too outdated to dominate, and far too expensive to rework from the inside. Then came the Great Depression. The crash of 1929 erased fortunes, throttled travel, and stripped away the lavish expense accounts that had once kept the Waldorf Astoria suites and dining rooms full. Maintenance costs climbed even as occupancy fell, And the very features that had made the hotel famous now demanded sums that no prudent investor could justify. At the same time, the land beneath the hotel became more valuable than the structure sitting on it. Developers and financiers walked past the red sandstone walls and saw not a beloved relic, but the site for a new kind of monument, one that measured prestige in floors and steel rather than ballrooms and staircases. The verdict arrived with the cold precision of an appraisal report. The hotel would be sold, and the wrecking crews would follow. Because the only thing powerful enough to replace the Waldorf Astoria in New York was a building that promised an entirely different scale of ambition. When the demolition began in 1929, New Yorkers looked on as crews chipped away at the red sandstone that had framed their city's great entrances and exits for a generation. The Waldorf Astoria had stood for less than 40 years, yet it had witnessed enough history to feel older than some European palaces. Workers dismantled copper trim, terracotta ornament, plaster ceilings, and carved wood that had once reflected the glow of chandeliers and the rustle of evening gowns. Ballrooms that had hosted princes, presidents, and society hostesses alike fell silent as dust, not music, rose into the air. For many, the destruction felt like a verdict on an entire way of building, a declaration that the age of lavish, hand-finished interiors was surrendering to something harder and taller. Still, not everything vanished into landfill. The most famous survivor was the 9-foot bronze clock commissioned for the 1893 World's Fair, long a meeting point in the hotel's corridors. It was carefully removed and transported uptown to the new Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue, where it continued to serve as both timekeeper and witness in a different lobby. Guests who stroll past it today may not realize that they're walking by an artifact that once witnessed the comings and goings of the Gilded Age. Other fragments found second lives in unexpected places. Blocks of red sandstone from the facade were shipped to Cornell University and incorporated into Bolt Hall, meaning students sleep within walls that once enclosed some of the most exclusive rooms in New York. Individual pieces of marble, woodwork, and hardware ended up with collectors and salvage dealers, scattered remnants of a vanished palace embedded quietly into new stories. Yet the most dramatic change unfolded above the cleared site itself. In place of the hotel rose the Empire State Building, an Art Deco skyscraper that would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes on the planet. New York did not swap the Waldorf Astoria for a parking structure or a bland office block. It exchanged a horizontal palace for a vertical statement, trading ballrooms for observation decks and fountains for a mast that once hosted Zeppelin dreams and now holds broadcast antennas. Some mourn that choice, arguing that the city abandoned its gift for ornamental romance in favor of something more severe. Others insist it was a fair trade, a shift from one icon to another that captured the restless, upward pull of New York better than any hotel ever could. Meanwhile, the Waldorf Astoria name itself migrated uptown. The new Park Avenue Hotel, opened in 1939, spoke in the language of Art Deco rather than German Renaissance, but it continued the tradition of hosting presidents, celebrities, and world leaders in spaces designed to make them feel they had arrived somewhere important. Guests who stayed there in the 20th century often commented that the building felt ancient when they learned it was comparatively new, a testament to how thoroughly the Waldorf aura had soaked into public imagination. Today, the original buildings live on through photographs, salvaged fragments, family stories, and the ongoing life of their successor on Park Avenue. The Waldorf and the Astoria may have been razed, but the idea of them still hangs over Midtown like a memory in stone. And in a city that constantly tears down its past to build its future, that lingering memory might be the most luxurious thing of all. Before social media handed influence to anyone with a camera and a tolerance for chaos, status in America moved through quieter channels and guarded doorways. Long before viral clips and algorithmic fame, a different kind of blue checkmark existed, stamped not on a profile, but on a calling card accepted or ignored inside a Fifth Avenue drawing room. In that world, the word society did not mean people in general. It meant a few hundred names in one city who decided what was elegant, what was vulgar, and who would spend the winter begging for invitations they controlled. At the center of that system stood the Astors, a family who took money, wrapped it in ritual, and turned it into something far more dangerous and enduring than cash alone. On today's episode of Old Money Empires, we're peeling back the curtain on exactly how the Astors built, branded, and enforced the very idea of high society for the 1% of the 1%. When people talk about old money in the United States, they picture Newport cottages and Gilded Age balls. But the country's first elites looked very different than the Astor's Fifth Avenue world. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, power lived on plantations in Virginia and Maryland, in mercantile houses along New England wharves, and in the hands of men whose fortunes were tied to land, trade, and enslaved labor. These families, Washingtons, Lees, Livingstons, Adamses, and others, produced presidents, generals, and diplomats who steered a revolution and wrote a constitution in a nation that officially rejected hereditary rank. The new republic celebrated the idea that talent, not titles, should carry the day, even if money and birth still opened doors that stayed locked for everyone else. Thomas Jefferson spoke of a natural aristocracy based on virtue and ability, and his circle included men who proved the point. Alexander Hamilton, born out of wedlock in the Caribbean, and Benjamin Franklin, the candlemaker's son who turned printing ink into influence. The model was clear. You could rise, but there would be no dukes, no earls, and no official court at the top of American life. Germany, the Astors' original homeland, offered the opposite pattern, a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities where titled families lined the upper rungs of society, and a butcher's son had almost no chance of climbing into those circles. In that world, someone like young John Jacob Astor might have become a prosperous tradesman at best, but he would have remained firmly outside true aristocratic life. America, by contrast, left room for raw fortune to reinvent itself as status. By the early 1800s, the United States had several pockets of established wealth: planter dynasties in the South, shipping and banking families in the Northeast, and land speculators riding the frontier, but no single unified high society ruling the entire urban stage. Boston had its Brahmins, Philadelphia its Quaker elites, and Charleston its rice and cotton families, yet each city played by its own rules and guarded its own guest lists. New York, still growing into its role as the country's commercial engine, hosted a mix of old Dutch names, revolutionary officers, and ambitious newcomers dealing in ships, sugar, and real estate. What the city lacked was a central referee with the authority to say who counted as respectable company and who was doomed to hover at the edge of the ballroom. Indeed, a fate worse than poverty for the families who built their identities around belonging. Now, in fact, we've documented the heiresses who hovered too long and the ones who clawed their way in through scandal in episodes too dark for YouTube. Those live free on our Substack at the first link in the video description, where we're already starting a monthly book club exploring the families who played society's game and lost everything. Now, the absence of that social referee mattered, because as fortunes grew in the young republic, so did anxiety about class, taste, and what separated good families from the noisy crowd of cash-rich newcomers pushing into townhouses and opera boxes. America had money, ambition, and emerging dynasties, but it did not yet have a shared code of social entry. That vacuum at the top of the ladder was waiting for a family bold enough to claim it, codify it, and turn their surname into the password for an entire way of life. By the middle of the 19th century, New York was done pretending it was a provincial port, and its swelling wealth demanded a hierarchy that could make sense of who belonged where. Ships crowded the harbor, rail lines fed new fortunes in the city, and parvenus armed with fresh cash pressed against doors once guarded by the old Dutch families who traced their roots back to New Amsterdam. The problem was that none of the older clans had the power or the will to impose order on a city changing faster than their traditions could keep up. Into that vacuum stepped a family whose fortune had begun in furs and matured in Manhattan lots, a clan positioned perfectly to decide who counted in a metropolis without a single fixed social authority. William Backhouse inherited not only his father's money, but his instinct for structure, and he fortified the family empire with patient real estate accumulation that turned the Astor name into a gravitational force on the island of Manhattan. He bought land the way other men bought stock, steadily and without fanfare, until his holdings ran like seams beneath whole neighborhoods that were only beginning to take shape. While other fortunes rose in sudden bursts, the Astor fortune expanded like a tide, slow, unstoppable, and impossible to ignore. But even that wealth didn't guarantee social power, because New York City was not yet under Astor control. That influence came from a very different source: William's wife, Caroline Schermerhorn, a woman whose Dutch lineage stretched deeper than most of the city's sidewalks, and whose instinct for social strategy operated with the precision of a seasoned diplomat. Caroline, Lena to her family, came from the Schermerhorns and the Van Cortlandts, two Dutch dynasties rooted in New York long before Wall Street or steamships reshaped the city's skyline. Her Schermerhorn forebears built counting houses along South Street, shipped goods between Charleston and Manhattan, and secured acreage that would later form the backbone of Brooklyn's grand cemeteries. From her mother's side came the Van Cortlandts and the Beekmans, families whose patents, mayoralties, and sprawling manors helped define the old colonial hierarchy of New York. Lena grew up moving north with fashion itself, from Greenwich Street to Bond Street, absorbing every stop. The confidence that comes from knowing your ancestors helped build the very city others were scrambling to enter. At Madame Bensay's French school, she learned posture, languages, and the subtle mechanics of presence, skills that would later allow her to command a drawing room with a raised eyebrow. When she married William Astor in 1853, society murmured that she had married up in wealth but down in lineage, an imbalance she quickly reframed as the Astor family's ticket into circles even money couldn't buy. Across this scene moved Samuel Ward McAllister of Savannah, Georgia, a man whose Southern polish hit a calculating eye and whose family history ran through judges, senators, and revolutionary officers. He made a fortune in California, married a quiet heiress, and spent years in Europe studying aristocratic etiquette the way others studied law or medicine. In Newport, he tested America's aspiring elite with controlled gatherings on his Bayside farm, observing who understood manners instinctively and who merely copied them. By the time he and Mrs. Astor met, she brought pedigree and purpose, while he brought the architecture of social order, forming a partnership that would refashion New York's upper class into something deliberate rather than accidental. Their alliance created a system that rewarded lineage, punished overreach, and taught even the richest families that legitimacy required more than money, it required her approval. And soon, their rules, rituals, and hierarchies would harden into a world all its own, a theater where etiquette became power and where belonging carried stakes no fortune could ignore. Mrs. Astor's ballroom was not a stage for dancing so much as a pressure chamber, meticulously designed to test who understood the invisible rules that separated the merely wealthy from the truly accepted. Caroline knew that human behavior shifted the moment scarcity entered the room, and she wielded that scarcity with the quiet accuracy of someone who understood how much people fear being left outside of a closed door. Her annual January ball was a living audition, a place where a single misstep, a gown too new, a bow too deep, a joke delivered with too much eagerness, could confirm your status or end it. Every guest felt the weight of the moment they crossed her threshold, because being invited was only the first test. Behaving correctly under her gaze was the second. She understood that people reveal themselves not when they're comfortable, but when they're being measured, and she made sure society felt measured every second they were in her orbit. The architecture of the ballroom itself amplified this psychology, because guests moved past her portrait before they reached her, absorbing the implication that even her likeness commanded respect. Once inside, the hierarchy reinforced itself without announcement. Old families drifted naturally toward the center, while newcomers hovered at the edges, hoping proximity might translate into acceptance. Now, Caroline rarely corrected anyone directly. She didn't need to, because silence in her presence carried a far sharper edge than criticism. A raised chin, a delayed greeting, or a subtle turn of the shoulder from the Mrs. Astor could chill a reputation faster than printed gossip ever could. And at her side in this ritualistic theater stood Ward McAllister, the man who had memorized every tick of European courts and repurposed them for this new American aristocracy. Ward approached society as if it were a delicate machine requiring constant collaboration, and he saw himself as the operator who ensured no bolt loosened and no wheel wobbled out of rhythm. He had spent years cataloging distinctions that most people never noticed. How long a gentleman should linger before a bow. How far a lady could extend a gloved hand. How loudly laughter could rise before it read as vulgarity. These rules were not decoration. They were weapons designed to separate instinct from imitation, lineage from purchase, and belonging from aspiration. Ward's family circle dancing classes for debutantes became laboratories for observing how the next generation coped with performance under scrutiny, and he noted with precision who carried themselves with inherited ease. At the patriarch balls, he watched how guests navigated crowded rooms, who deferred to whom, and who misread the unspoken choreography that mapped out each interaction. He believed that social order depended on maintaining tension, a world where acceptance was achievable but never guaranteed, where everyone knew their ranking, whether it was spoken aloud or not. But the very psychology that made him powerful also made him vulnerable, because the people who relied on him most were the very same people who would turn on him if his authority ever became inconvenient. By the late 1880s, as the 400 gained mythic status, Ward had become both indispensable and resented, a man whose knowledge was admired, but whose presence reminded many of how manufactured their status truly was. And just as he reached the height of his influence, a young woman on Fifth Avenue was preparing a move that would expose every crack in the hierarchy he and Mrs. Astor had built, because Alva Vanderbilt was about to demonstrate that spectacle could break any wall, even one guarded by an Astor. For years, Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister had kept New York society in a tight corset of rules, lineage, and choreography, but power built on exclusion always invites a challenger bold enough to ignore the door entirely. That challenger arrived in the form of Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, a woman who understood instinctively that money alone wasn't enough to claim the throne, but spectacle could unseat the reigning monarch. Alva had married into the Vanderbilt fortune, a railroad empire so vast it dwarfed the old Dutch estates that had once shaped Manhattan's early elite. Yet despite its size, the Vanderbilt fortune remained socially radioactive in Mrs. Astor's world, seen as new money powered by soot, steam, and unrefined ambition. Alva refused to accept that verdict because she believed that if society ran on codes, then codes could be broken or even rewritten. Her opportunity arrived in 1883 when her new French Gothic mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue was nearing completion, an audacious structure designed to make every brownstone on the avenue look timid. Inside those pointed arches and gilded halls, she planned a masquerade ball of such scale that even the Astors would have to acknowledge it. Alva dispatched 1,200 invitations, a number that made Mrs. Astor's exclusivity look provincial and her ballrooms suddenly small. But the masterstroke came when Alva forgot to send an invitation to Carrie Astor, Caroline's daughter, citing the iron rule that a lady could not send an invitation to a social superior who had never paid her a formal call. Mrs. Astor, who had spent decades training New York to live inside the etiquette she enforced, suddenly found herself caught in her own architecture. The city whispered, watched, and waited to see whether the queen of society would cling to her own superiority or bend to the woman whose wealth was rewriting the Gilded Age in real time. Caroline made the call. She arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion, left her card as protocol demanded, and received her daughter's invitation the next day. An act of concession that ricocheted through New York like a starting gun. When Mrs. Astor herself arrived at the ball dressed as a Venetian princess, she acknowledged the truth that no one dared say aloud. The Vanderbilts had forced their way into the 400 not through lineage or diplomacy, but through sheer force of spectacle. The result was breathtaking. The Vanderbilt Ball became the defining event of the decade, a knight of gilded armor, jeweled masks, and engineered astonishment, proving that wealth unrestrained by modesty could outshine even the most established traditions. But for Ward McAllister, the evening was a warning signal. He recognized that his system was beginning to crack, because once the Vanderbilts broke through, others would follow, and the exclusivity that powered his own authority would thin with every new arrival. Mrs. Astor tried to absorb the shock by embracing the new arrivals just enough to retain control, but the balance she had perfected for decades was now unstable. The city was beginning to prefer noise to nuance and spectacle to pedigree. And as that shift accelerated, both Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister would feel the foundations of their shared kingdom tremble beneath their feet, pushing them toward the final act of their intertwined reign. By the early 1890s, Mrs. Astor still stood at the center of New York society, but the authority she once wielded effortlessly now met resistance from a rising generation that cared less for pedigree and more for spectacle. The Gilded Age had grown louder, faster, and more flamboyant, and the quiet tyranny of lineage no longer intimidated families whose fortunes outpaced their patience for old rules. Caroline entered the decade as a widow, having lost William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1892, and her response was not grief, but immaculate form, observing mourning because etiquette demanded it rather than sentiment. A year later, tragedy struck again when her daughter, Helen Roosevelt, died of an overdose at 34, a loss from which Caroline never fully recovered. When she returned to society after that second period of mourning, she found her reign challenged by newcomers such as Alva Belmont, Mamie Fish, and Teresa Fair Ulrichs, women who had no interest in bowing to a hierarchy designed decades before they arrived. Simultaneously, her feud with her nephew William Walldorf erupted into open architecture when he built the original Waldorf Hotel next to her mansion at 5th Avenue and 34th Street, driving her from the neighborhood that had once symbolized her power. And her response was legendary. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to build a French Renaissance palace at 5th Avenue, a double mansion designed so that her ballroom could not hold 400 but 1,200 guests, an explicit marble and gilt declaration that the throne had moved north. Caroline lived in the northern half, her son John Jacob Astor IV in the southern, and from there she hosted glittering dinners, including a formal evening for Prince Louis of Battenberg, accompanied by Victor Herbert's orchestra. Her final ball in 1905 was a spectacle of its own, with Mrs. Astor, now 74, receiving 800 guests dressed in purple velvet trimmed with sable and jewels said to have belonged to Marie Antoinette. But her world was collapsing quietly behind the music. Ward McAllister, once her indispensable right-hand man, had destroyed himself by publishing Society as I Have Found It, a memoir so indiscreet that it turned him from gatekeeper to pariah overnight. The elite mocked him, the newspapers him, and even Mrs. Astor withdrew her protection, refusing invitations and allowing him to slide into social irrelevance. He died in 1895, alone and disgraced, while a charity ball he would have once overseen unfolded without him. Mrs. Astor's own decline came slowly and with devastating dignity, beginning with a fall down her marble staircase that plunged her into dementia and turned her palatial home into a silent mausoleum of shuttered rooms and imagined parties. She died in 1908, her mind lost to the grand rituals she had once commanded, and with her passing, the last true matriarch of Gilded Age society vanished. Her son would perish on the Titanic 4 years later, and her Fifth Avenue palace, like nearly every mansion of the era, was demolished within a generation.